Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Queen's inaugural Provost Lecture. Today we are expecting more than 200 old members, fellows, students from around 20 countries or more. And you're all very welcome, but of course I'd really like to extend a special welcome to our speaker, Mayor Eric Garcetti. And especially in a tumultuous year like 2020, there couldn't be anybody better to talk about leadership in times of crisis and challenge. I'll introduce Eric properly in a moment, but before I do that, I just wanted to remind you how the evening will run. So we're going to start first by hearing from Eric for a little while, then he and I will have a conversation. And meanwhile, if you have any questions you'd like to ask him, then please type them into the chat function, and we'll make sure that there are time for as many as we possibly can. So Mayor Garcetti received his BA and MA from Columbia University, but then he came to Queen's, and that was as a Rhodes Scholar and read International Relations in 1993. He went on from Oxford to the London School of Economics and then into the public sector, and was 4 terms council president to LA City Council. He was elected as the 42nd mayor of Los Angeles in 2013 and re-elected in 2017. Despite all of that, he has very kindly kept in touch with Queen's on several occasions, and most recently hosted a joint reception for Queen's with Wadham College, which is where his wife is an alumna, and the Queen's College Choir, which you can hear elsewhere on the website tonight. The Queen's College Choir sang at that, and that was at the mayor's residence in Los Angeles. So welcome, Eric. It's lovely to have you here. And I would really like to invite you to talk to us today about leadership.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and a very good evening, Provost Craig. Thank you for the kind invitation to join with you. It's great to be with folks from around not only Britain, but the world who are virtually gathering at our beloved college. And what an honor it is for me to join you today, both as an old member and an honorary fellow at the Queen's College. And you know, this moment in our lives is full of so much that we're holding, so much pain, so many challenges. And this year will go down as the most challenging in our lives. But as I thought about this speech tonight, there's so much from my Oxford experience that still resonates in my life today, as I'm sure it does for each one of us. I remember the young graduate student right there at the portal of Queen's who greeted me when I came off the bus in this strange and alien place that was beautiful and haunting and all of the things we know. And I went up to his room to talk about one day we wanted to change the world. And today he's my friend, Senator Cory Booker. I remember back the brilliant woman I met studying politics named Amy, who then became my wife and my partner. The British and African and Asian friends who taught me to feel at home almost anywhere in the world, coming from a diverse place like Los Angeles that I saw mirrored on the streets of Oxford. And whether it was performing in plays or in the MCR doing an improv show, they prepared me for the high drama of city council meetings and public gatherings that is part of what politics are, to always keep a sense of humor and a sense of connection with folks. Whether it was protesting the detention of asylum seekers at Campsfield, a memory I held close when I traveled last year to the US-Mexico border to speak out against the horrors of caged kids and separated families. I felt that resonance. And then, you know, I knew then, as I know now, that so much of our lives, because certainly before Oxford it was this way, and since, are a giant run-on sentence with never a break. But as a young man finding my way, the Queen's College was a moment of punctuation, commas to pause, periods to finish a thought, plenty of question marks about where we were and who I was and what I wanted to do, and exclamation points all the time to celebrate life's gifts. And now the Queen's College is here again, calling on me to kind of pause and reflect in this year as the inaugural speaker for the Provost Lecture, and to make some sense of the world around me and to share some thoughts about our place in it. So, you know, I heard the joke the other day that we've now just entered the 35th week of March. And certainly that's what this year feels like. In some moments, time sweeps by like a racing car. Other times it crawls almost to a halt. It feels like the dripping clocks of a Salvador Dali painting. We're unmoored from our rhythms and our relationships. We're disconnected from our routines and our human connections. And these days can feel endless and exhausting. And if we're lucky enough not to be physically sick, I think all of us are heart sick, separated from the people that we love the most in the very moments we need them. A once-in-a-century plague, a devastating economic downturn in my country, but joined with folks around the world, a reckoning with racial injustice and new threats to democracy across the globe. But as we weather these currents, we can't ignore the sea of the other challenges that also predated and will postdate this pandemic. The work of climate change, the biggest threat to our lives, unlocking opportunity for children and building a more equitable and fair world and societies. I'm so lucky to live in one of the most dynamic cities on the globe, the third largest now metropolitan economy in the world, a place where 19 million souls put their heads down each night and 19 million stories follow. And as their mayor, I have this awesome responsibility to try to mobilize the power of these millions, but also to tell their collective story, and not just to confront a crisis, but to reimagine our future. So I'm looking forward to this conversation we're going to have today, whether it's about COVID or a recent presidential election, whatever is on your mind. But before we get there, let me address the title of this talk and share what I've learned this year. This year we didn't want, and I've always said leadership is defined not by what we set out to do and how well we do it, but what we don't expect to happen and how well we react to that. And so this question of leadership is how we meet the most urgent needs of this moment and prepare the next after this pandemic has come and gone. How do we, in other words, practice leadership that's not only for this year, but for this time, this era of rapid and accelerating change? To me, it comes down to four primary principles of leadership that I've learned really this year. Maybe the past years led up to it, but they really crystallized this year. First is to accelerate. We already live in an age of incredible velocity. Technology, economy, ecology are changing more quickly than even the human ability to keep up with them. And let's be honest, once COVID-19 is in the rearview mirror, and it will be one day, we'll be hurtling towards the next challenge, the next modern crisis. When the virus arrived in my city, I spent late nights wrapping my head around early virus numbers, trying to understand the science and reading history of past pandemics, poring over archives, searching for what succeeded 100 years ago, as well as documented, and reading stories about medieval leaders thrown from their castle and beheaded because people didn't like what was happening. Luckily, we live in slightly more generous times. But I also saw case projections that left me in tears. I saw hundreds of thousands of my people dying. So we became the first big city in America to act, to accelerate. And we shut down bars and restaurants and gathering places. We were the first city in America to do that, the first to institute a stay-at-home order, the first to mandate masks, even when some were still questioning whether they were effective. And these were by far the heaviest decisions of my life. I knew how many people would lose their jobs, how many people's lives were threatened, the new economic threats that would emerge. But interestingly enough, they were also some of the easiest decisions I've ever made. It was clear that no priority ranks higher than protecting human lives. And as we accelerate, as long as it's based on those core values we hold, go fast. And now months have passed and we've had time and space to measure the impact of those actions. We didn't do everything perfectly. We failed and we learned. But the data is clear that those early moves translated into tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who will never be able to count or point out who are alive. And those initial restrictions helped us avert a terrible fate that we saw in other places of teeming hospitals and makeshift morgues that befell other cities. So often we're afraid to act first. We're afraid that we'll swing and miss, to use a baseball or cricket metaphor. So we wait for someone else to do it, or we employ a scientific method that is really important when it comes to academic research, but it's too slow and plodding for wartime, which is essentially what this is, wartime leadership. There's a time and place for trial and error, but when lives are on the line, you have to act. So let's be clear, dealing with this pandemic is not as simple as one set of choices. COVID-19 has forced us to make changes as this virus surges and new dangers emerge, even as we speak today. But that very decision to act fast and to act first became a touchstone for leadership in our pandemic response. So our speed has been essential, but it's not the whole story. So let me turn to the second principle. When there's so much at stake, it isn't enough just to accelerate. You also have to embrace innovating. And these are closely related, but they're different. I was reminded of the second principle of leadership when the scope of this pandemic was coming into full view, because as we faced the worst health crisis in a century, we also were contending with another reality, that my city doesn't have a health department. I won't bore you with how things are structured in America, but we have a county of Los Angeles, and they have the jurisdiction of public health. That made things tricky, especially in the first days when we were learning something new and critical about the virus every hour. And we learned that COVID was spread by folks with no symptoms, making it even more terrifying and harder to control. I tried to rally support at the authorities that would test people without symptoms, but they said, no, we think this is bad medicine. Not everybody was on board. And so I got my team together and said, look, I know it's not our lane, it's not what we do, but if others won't do asymptomatic testing, let's do it ourselves. We had no idea where the money would come from, who would run the testing, but we found a way. We locked down a local new company that was a startup to make sure we had tests that we could expand rapidly and that could turn around those tests in 24 hours. We locked down that supply chain. We procured parking lots. We put our fire department to work alongside volunteers from an organization called CORE that Sean Penn had organized to work in Haiti, but that was based in Los Angeles, who stepped up. And just under 40 days, we became the first big city in America to offer testing to all residents with or without symptoms, free of charge. Now, that innovation in government, that innovation was, in my opinion, government at its finest. Don't worry about your jurisdiction or the walls or silos that hold you back. You can't rely on old ways. You have to create new ones through innovation. We saw that with our economy too. We saw the blows that people were withstanding, the inability to pay for rent. And we said, if renters are suddenly without income, let's keep them housed. And we established the first moratorium on evictions in the country and the largest direct rental assistance program. We bought 4,000 homeless, unhoused Angelenos off the streets and put them into hotel and motel rooms that were empty and put those workers back to work. We witnessed a federal government deciding that only some Americans were worthy of aid so that immigrants who had worked hard and paid taxes, their spouses and their children received $0 when every other American family received a check. So we raised $45 million and said anybody can access this money, even if you're an immigrant that's here. And 100,000 families were able to get that assistance. So in each and every instance, it's proved to me how creative leadership has to be, how scary that can be, but we had to fill a void where no one else did. We had to breathe life into new old institutions, and we had to also network. So this brings me to the third part of leadership, which is to collaborate. You know, leaders are taught to be these solitary figures. We write them in biographies as if, you know, Winston Churchill single-handedly did X and Martin Luther King did Y. But my close relationships with fellow mayors across the country and across the world has been so critical to my leadership lessons. As event after event began piling on each other, I started something simple, which was a text thread between 15 of the 20 largest city mayors in America. As we had, people looting on the streets, who's bringing in the National Guard and who's not, what ideas for racial justice, what are people doing on testing, or how's everybody feeling? That collaboration sustains us, both with the policy and the personal needs that we have. And we did the same thing internationally. I hit the bat signal, and as chair of C40 Cities, which is 97 megacities of the world that I chair confronting climate change, we suddenly had 55 mayors on a single call. It was one of the most moving experiences of my life to have the mayor of Seoul, South Korea, talking about testing, the mayor of Delhi saying he had just locked down his city, and the national leadership 2 days of 1 billion people followed, to have the mayor of Milan, when people were dying in those hospital rooms, tell us what was coming, so that we all could act much more quickly than even national governments. Because a crisis in one of our cities is a crisis for all of our cities. So collaboration isn't some sort of buzzword that we hear. It's absolutely a necessity. In my part of the world, we've seen neighbors feeding neighbors, healthcare systems and university labs forging new advancements. Oxford's played a huge role in vaccine development. And together in Los Angeles, we can count the lives saved, the homes that have kept, and the jobs recovered as a direct result of these partnerships. And our groundbreaking testing program that I mentioned with CORE brought its experience with rapid response and disaster zones to the streets of our city, where we always have a sort of arrogance, well, that's for places overseas, not right here in our backyards. And we didn't end with testing, whether it was the Citizen app that 1 million people had downloaded already just to know what's going on in their neighborhood, launched a local contact tracing app, and we were the first city to do that in America. We partnered with hospitals to provide childcare resources to our essential employees who didn't know whether they could show up to work. We collaborated with internet providers to go into our public housing to give free Wi-Fi to students who had no access to broadband and were falling further and further behind. One thing about collaboration, though, that I'll point out is it has to be the result of years of relational work. If you try to collaborate when the crisis hits and you haven't been investing for years on those relationships, learning those values and personalities, it won't work. The text I was able to send to the county health director saying we need to move faster, or the email that I sent out to faith leaders asking them for their prayers and their participation, even the call I made to the Trump White House, where I was able to call somebody I met in childcare as a fellow father, who in half hour before the negotiations on the first CARES Act went through, I said, cities need money. And he changed the negotiations and we got $700 million we wouldn't have gotten. You never know where those investments and relationships will come. So it's that power to convene, connect, and collaborate that are so important. And it's your power too. I'm conscious of the time, so let me kind of jump back to the last one and wrap things up. The final principle I want to share, and something I certainly learned at Oxford, is the importance in leadership of communicate. So remember, we had accelerate, collaborate, innovate, collaborate, and then communicate. I really do feel that leaders are storytellers. I'm no stranger to intense debates. I've been shouted down at town hall meetings. I've had protests pop up outside my home. I've had people approach me in restaurants to say kind and colorful things. It comes with the territory. And over the years, I've learned to filter out the overly kind praise and the vitriol and try to focus on the work. But this pandemic has put people even more on edge. It's turned up the volume on every other issue. As I mentioned, in medieval times during plagues, they literally drag leaders out of their castles and execute them. So things are a little better now, but violence is up around the world during this pandemic. Leaders are saddled with extraordinary blame, and so many people are feeling powerless. So in moments like this, how do you summon that strength as a leader, but also how do you make leaders out of everybody you're talking to in your company, your university, or your city? We need to place people not as passive observers, but active and powerful authors of their own story. In the first 3 months of COVID, I told that story every evening by speaking directly to the people of Los Angeles. We did 56 COVID briefings basically in a row, now 75 total. Prime time every night on multiple channels, speaking to people where they lived and where they were shut in. And the impact of these briefings became very clear very quickly, that everybody was feeling adrift. The briefings were an anchor though. When I would skip a night, we'd get all these calls. Where was he? I need to hear where things are. And that communication, when questions and rumors are flying, to give timely and credible answers, to tell people bad news straight, not to say, as we heard from our president, it's just gonna go away, but also not to say to people, it's so bad you can't do anything about it. You have to reassure, send strength and love, and again, action that people can take, to give warnings when cases are rising, but share relief when infections are lower, announce tools and programs, remind people of the importance of their daily actions of testing, tracing, washing their hands, keeping their distance. When the idea of wearing a mask still felt foreign and our president was ignoring it, I said, real men wear masks. I tried to motivate people from whatever it took, from machismo to pure love and science, everything in between. And I think in the many moments when people have felt dark, I've tried to help people see rays of light. And that is the job of leadership, to communicate with clarity and honesty, to help people see a moment beyond this one. And as we turn to our discussion, because you've invited an American to give this inaugural lecture, and I'm honored, I wanted to just address this moment when America is shifting to a new administration. Because in many ways, the America I live in is a reflection of the world tomorrow, arguably the most diverse city in human history, a place full of Britons and full of Armenians and full of Guatemalans and full of Thais and full of Congolese, people from every city and country and continent. But we're all responsive to the same stimuli and vulnerable to the same toxins as everybody else. And we can be lifted by humanity's highest ideals or weighed down by our basest instincts. And for the last 4 years, unfortunately, in my opinion, the latter too often prevailed in my country. So when I reflect on my time leading the city, there's nothing that gives me greater pride than winning the Olympic and Paralympic Games for Los Angeles. It's kind of the gold medal of mayoral competition. It was a transformative thing in LA in 1932 when nobody knew where LA was, but it was the Depression, so we said, we'll do it. And in 1984, when the boycotts were happening and Olympics had no money, we raised our hand again and had the most successful and profitable Olympics. So my first act when I was sworn in as mayor was to send a letter to the Olympics saying we were interested. And the odds were not in our favor. It was a late entry. They chose Boston to be the US bid first. Then they dropped out, came back to us, said, are you still interested? Even President Obama, after 2 American bids where he had traveled for the Chicago one personally, had lost. And we submitted a strong pitch and managed to make it to the finals. I was ecstatic. And I marked my calendar for the week that the Olympic Committee would come to assess Los Angeles, began preparing to make the case. And finally, folks came from around the world to LA so we could show off why these games were going to be extraordinary. But then that week, my president, Donald Trump, our president, the president, carried out his abhorrent Muslim ban, blocking travel from countries from which our visitors had just arrived. And suddenly the whole visit changed. One athlete from a Muslim country said, "How can you even guarantee that my countrymen and women will be admitted into your country?" We weren't talking about attractions and venues. We were talking about morals and values. They stopped talking about logistics and asked, "Who are you?" One person wanted to know, why should we do business with a place that won't even do business with us? It was a shameful moment, but I had to think hard that if we're a nation that shuts out the world, why should we be entrusted to invite the world there? And, you know, one of the best pieces of advice I got, and this is good life advice, is somebody said, you can't just say why you're going to be great for them. Can you imagine us closing the deal with our future spouse by saying, I'm going to be so good for you? We tell them what they will do for us, how they will make us better. And I guess I'll close on this by saying, leadership is often about recognizing how others will improve you, make you better, and articulating that. In America, we're so good at closing into ourselves. We've shown that to the world for 4 years. We're big enough, we're isolated geographically enough that we can become insular and talk about walls and actually erect them metaphorically. But we are at our best when we open up to the world, and we're reminded of that. And it's a lesson not just for nations, not just for administrations or government leaders, but for people as well. One that Oxford and the Queen's College knows well. And that message which ultimately won us the Olympics, of that you will make us better and that our place is in the world. That's the lesson I learned at the Queen's College. From a kid from Los Angeles living in England, I know the days felt very long and absolutely very gray when I'm used to sunshine every day. But I'll remember one lesson, that what the Queen's College in Oxford taught me is because you have so many gray days, when those first days of summer come, when the air turns warm and the sun comes out, everyone runs outside and pulls up their t-shirts and shorts and take to the fields and embrace each other. It's been a very long, dark day, but I do believe that the sun is peeking through the clouds. So let's get ready for that sunshine. Get ready to run into those fields and to get into the boats and to get a bottle of champagne and a picnic and to be able to celebrate not just that the sun is back, but this world has been restored and the strength of humanity has been put forward. Thank you, Provost. And with that, I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. I mean, that wasn't a punctuation mark so much as a poem, I think, in its way. Absolutely fascinating. And I have some questions beginning to come through, but I hardly know where to begin myself, because also you talk about communication and leadership, but also what you say is so vivid, just back to the dripping clocks and of time at the beginning. Absolutely fascinating. What I actually particularly wanted to ask you, though, was you've talked at one point about making leaders out of everyone you talk to. And I know that you've focused particularly on communicating in ways that are giving people agency over their lives as part of dealing with these incredibly difficult times. Can you say a little bit more about how you go about doing that?
Yeah, you know, I know that people have read the biography of President Obama as a community organizer, and the right in this country kind of made fun of that, thinking that it's just a bunch of lefties. But there's a methodology, no matter what your ideology is, to community organizing, which is all about how do you, one, connect people through relationships that are one-on-one, those coffees, those moments where you build a network of people by first connecting with them. And second, the methodology of actually then building movements based on unexpected leaders. Because most people think of leaders, oh, that's those people. I'm not a leader, I'm just a person. And thank God I'm not a leader. So it's a stressful thing to understand that you are, but it's an empowering one to realize that you are. So when I became a city council member nearly 20 years ago, I ran when I was 29 years old, but got elected when I was 30. And I brought into government a woman who's now chief of staff for me and has stayed with me. So I guess we've worked really well together for a long time. A woman who came from community organizing. And I said, we're not just going to wait for the phone calls to come in. We're going to teach people how city government works. And we're going to leave behind an empowered group, a community that understands how to fight for their own needs. And I think, that's a scary thing for leaders to do, because in a democracy, certainly, people said, well, aren't they going to sometimes campaign against you and on issues disagree with you? And I said, yes, very much so, but you're either a small d Democrat or not. Hopefully we'll agree more times than not, and sometimes I'll have to respectfully disagree with my constituents because they've elected me to sometimes use that judgment. But I'd much rather have that than the same old quote unquote leaders, the grass tops, claiming that they speak for everybody when 99% of people don't. And the last thing I'll say is I'm very worried about how people think and learn right now. If it's not a hashtag or a tweet, it's not real. I was reading this really great article about 4 teenage girls in Nashville or Memphis, it might have been, who put something out there and had a wonderful Black Lives Matter kind of protest in their city. And one of them was saying, one day I want to be president. The other one's like, I'm going to be a CEO. They were multiracial. It was an amazing article. And then they said, where do you get your news sources? And they said, Twitter, anything that's in, the mainstream news is fake. Now, I've heard that certainly from President Trump, but the idea that young people just fundamentally say, if it's out there in a few things from somebody who sounds credible, it must be real. We've lost the rigor of the thought of getting to truth slower, deeper, and sometimes more contradictorily. And it feeds us almost like dopamine. Choose a side and then just reinforce that side with quick hits on that learning. So part of how we create those leaders is also helping them to know very old-fashioned lessons from places like Oxford about how to learn and how to think.
That's fascinating, because I can see we've already had quite a few comments and questions about divides and about fractures within society, US, but not only, by any manner of means, and how you begin to create the space to enable people to certainly not just get beyond seeking out different sources of information from the social media that reinforce their, but actually creating spaces where people will listen to each other in kind of deeper ways. Can you say something about how you go about doing that in your amazing mix of Los Angelinos?
Well, I think you're right. It's not unique to Los Angeles. Right now, we live in a world that wants you to choose sides. I mean, if you look at, for instance, the marches for racial justice, which are, to me, such a powerful and exciting moment, the chance for America to really fully birth a true multiracial democracy. But I'm worried about where that work is. I'm not worried about it personally. For instance, we're doing some very cutting edge things in Los Angeles. We announced 2 weeks ago that we will have 24/7 through our 911 emergency calls, non-police responses to nonviolent mental health crises, especially on our streets. And right now, they usually end fine, but not with great outcomes in terms of healing. But at 2 a.m., we only call the police because that's the only service we have, or the fire department at 2 a.m., when what we actually need is mental health professionals. And that was a big part of the protest, because sometimes in certain places that's ended tragically, somebody being shot because it seems like they're violent when they're just schizophrenic and they're not going to harm somebody, or they need mental health care. But I hope we won't lose this moment. And right now, the sides that you're forced to choose between, are you pro-police or are you pro, racial justice? And to hold both of those things, is very difficult. I've worked for 19 years with police officers. I've held the mother of, an immigrant who came to our country and whose son became a police officer in the low-income community where he grew up, who was shot and killed. People who have literally put their lives on the line, heroes who show up unpaid on the weekends to help clean up alleyways. I mean, police officers to me are not like some class of people that are bad. There's culture that has infected police departments that can often be very destructive and bad. But I refuse to stop telling those good stories. And at moments when 1 out of 10,000 or 10 out of 10,000 or 50 out of 10,000 use tactics during a very fluid moment where it was maybe rougher than they should have, we kind of suddenly say, well, as we see in the graffiti, ACAB, all cops are bastards, like people dehumanizing a class of people in the same way that African Americans, Latinos, other racial minorities in our country have been dehumanized. And I wouldn't equate the two. To be Black in America, you probably deal with much more structural prejudice and difficulties than being a police officer. But if we dehumanize, that's my greatest fear right now. If we dehumanize, whether it's somebody with a badge or somebody because of the color of their skin, how do we move forward? So we'll do these reforms, but cops will go even into more of a bunker mentality. Culture will eat the policy that we have moving forward, and vice versa. Folks there out on the street will say, see, I told you nothing was actually going to happen. So I hope we can move away from the choose the side-ism and move towards a duality of holding multiple truths at the same time. But it's very difficult to do in this day and age.
And are you suggesting from what you're saying about leaders as storytellers that part of leadership is enacting that, holding the multiple truths, telling it and showing it?
Yeah, and it's funny to me, Dr. Craig, because I will say things and people's ears don't hear them anymore. In the midst of the worst moments here, when we did have some, in my opinion, probably tactics that went too far against protesters during some of the marches, and there'll be accountability on that, but most police officers also did a very good job protecting the rights of people, tens of thousands of people to be on our streets. I would say those nights, our police officers are heroes. I've seen that. And then I talk about police reform, and I talk to every, police officers out there, and they say, you just beat up on us the other night. I'm like, no, actually go back and listen. Like 90, in other words, if you say one thing that's critical now, either direction, somebody takes that, makes the video of it, tweets that out, or people just with their ears only hear that. In other words, we almost only want 100% agreement with ourselves, or else somebody is hostile to us. And I haven't quite solved how to do that, except just staying with who you are. You have to be authentic, and you have to realize the cliche is true, that time does heal things, that over time, I watched my father, he was a prosecutor, civil servant his whole life, but to be the chief prosecutor in Los Angeles, you have to run for office. So he ran for district attorney. Actually, when I was at Queens College, he was running for re-election. I took a little time off, and he had just been elected. The O.J. Simpson trial was under his jurisdiction. I was in England for most of it. When people say, was that intense? I said, no, I was in England, thankfully. But after 2 terms, I saw him not run for a 3rd term and not get re-elected, 65-35 against him. And it was very tough for him. It was sad for me as his son. But 2 years later, people came up to him and said, hey, I didn't vote for you, but I love you. Gil Garcetti, awesome. Will you take a picture with me? And you realize the pain of any given moment, that people over time, you become a symbol. You're lifted up far more than you deserve, and you're taken down much more than you deserve as well. And if leaders can withstand that in this day and age, and it is very tough, because there are people who do want to kind of cancel people instantly. I'm not going to buy in the whole cancel culture riff, but there are people who can quickly kind of take you down. But let yourself have some time and breathe, and keep being consistent and keep being authentic. And I believe over time, people will feel and know you.
Gosh, right. I'm going to switch to some more practical questions that have come up, which are around and staying with the current year for a moment. Questions about how you've been able to make decisions that, for example, have hit businesses. Kind of what kinds of ways that you've found through that, and also how you've supported them. And people are actually asking, and I mean, this may not be exactly the line to follow, but quite granular things. When do you shut a theatre? How do you support a specific type of business?
Yeah.
In the midst of all that's going on, can you just say something about how you also deal with that? Quite granular practicality.
Sure, and this is still a royal mess everywhere in the world. We've never been smarter about COVID, and we've never been less informed. In other words, we know now that blanket shutdowns are effective at the beginning to get people in line, but a blanket shutdown, like I was saying, we're about to have our worst numbers, like most of the world, from this pandemic in the coming weeks if trends continue, with the same things open and closed as just a few weeks ago when we had the very best numbers. So it isn't just what's open and closed. And contact tracing, short of more kind of totalitarian techno societies, will never be able to give you the granularity that of, like when everybody says, well, where is this spread happening? Well, unless you want me to put a tracker on you and connect the trackers of everybody, we kind of can do some of that through people's anonymized cell phone data, and we're doing that globally. I don't know. How many people did you have in your backyard? And no tracker is going to tell me, did you take the mask off because you thought while you're talking it was okay, even though that's higher risk? 6 feet isn't some magical number. 2 meters isn't like a magical number. It's just a suggested one. You went inside because it was cold, but you opened the windows and thought that was okay. So, we look at the science, we look at the risk. We've had people who have done, and it's very publicly available. There's a great one from University of Texas that shows kind of by venue what the risk is. But what you can't put in a chart like that is the behavior within a venue. For instance, outdoor dining, which we've done very successfully here, and we can keep going in the winter because of our weather. People sit down very close to each other. You obviously have to take a mask off when you're eating and drinking, but then they keep the mask off the whole time because, you can sip slowly, but you really need to have it on 90% of the time and take it off for the 10% when you're inserting food or liquid in your mouth. But people aren't doing that. And so I think all of these things are contributing at this moment. So to me, I've evolved to the place where I've told, it's a tough thing. My team we are the most aggressive pro-closure city in the country at the start. And I told them about 2 months in, you now have to shift to being in your mindset, not part of team closure, but team opening, because that is as important as what we close, to do it safely, to learn those lessons. For instance, construction, I never shut down. That was the biggest risk. A lot of other places did. But I knew it was outdoors, and we put really strict inspections, protocols, safety officers, and we never had outbreaks, and we kept tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs moving forward. We've actually accelerated infrastructure, saved money. We're building out things that would have taken much longer. So we're both smarter and dumber than we've ever been about this. But I do believe that the smarts are telling us, don't just do these blanket closures, trim the sails and try to influence behavior. That's probably more bang for the buck than regulations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to move outwards a little bit and maybe forwards. So you said near the beginning, thinking not just about, as it were, surviving this year, but actually thriving and building for the future. And in your Accelerate, Innovate, Collaborate, Communicate, there is an idea of changing things, perhaps not just to deal with today, but to change the way things get done. Can you pick out a few that you think maybe will be really impactful, that you see as good things that will happen out of the all of the turmoil?
It's tough in the fog of war to know where we're going to march out of it, but I do think I'll give you a couple of thoughts. I mean, we convened out of the C40 cities. I asked Mayor Sala, who's the mayor of Milan, to chair, and we put a dynamic mayor from every continent in the world, besides Antarctica, on a group that came together with a task force of recommendations for cities responding to and emerging from COVID-19. And because most people do live in cities now in the world, and certainly in places like Britain and the US, a great majority of people do, I think that's a place where we'll see some very important shifts if we get this right. So one of the things we said is there should be no stimulus that's not a green stimulus. People worried early on in this, is it going to be because things are so bad, like just use coal and gas and oil to like restart the economy, when in fact, this is a moment, and usually after wars and depressions is when you can fundamentally change the mode, the design of things, from economies to the way we move and the way we conduct commerce. And so I do think that we will emerge from this with an accelerated, greener economy and infrastructure. I think some of that will play out in very micro ways, whether it's more outdoor dining, less red tape, I hope, of government. We tried things, I said, just find a way to get to yes on so many things, because government's so good at telling you the 1 out of 10 reasons why it's no, that you didn't fulfill that requirement. So I think we'll have greater flexibility. I do think that there will also be a change in terms of the integration of values around equity. And that can be racial, that could be gender, but this pandemic's kind of laid bare the things that predated this long before this on health, whether it's the health of our planet and climate, or whether it's just the health conditions. And you have a national healthcare system. We don't in America, and many places that don't have that, especially in the developing world. I think it's laid bare just the needs to address health much more broadly. And I think in my country, people will be much more conscious of that. And then finally, I think, but I don't know, I expect there to be a burst of kind of kindness and comedy to one of each other with an ITY, like the coming together of people and a valuing of that. Now, our memories are short. Maybe 5 years from now, it'll be back to business as usual. But how we capitalize on that, I think, is going to be critical for institutions and for governments to really have a sense of unified purpose for the challenges that remain.
Mm-hmm. And looking globally, there are a few questions about things like the changing dynamics between the US and the UK, and the US and China. Clearly, from British point of view, we're not just dealing with the pandemic, but also anticipating the consequences of the final stage of Brexit.
Yeah.
And there's you have your own election results. What's your sense of how, particularly perhaps, how the US's global role might change and how that might affect the UK, for example?
So I think it is such a fascinating time, because for us, we haven't rejected the last 4 years. We narrowly defeated. I mean, it's a strong win, but still a pretty split country. We narrowly defeated somebody being in charge of, I think, being more insular. And there's no question that Joe Biden, this incoming administration, will very much, I think, go back to traditional allies and build those alliances up. Will be tougher with traditional adversaries. And then those in between that are just critical relationships like China remain to be defined. The strength of it's so much tougher to come together than it is to break things apart. Negative energy is much more powerful than positive. But if the European Union, and now Britain standing outside of that, if Europe and North America with some East Asian allies can come together, I think we can really move not just the subject matter of what we do globally, but the methodology of that in order to provide a different path than what we see in China or Russia. You know, Russia more as the kamikaze pilot, China more as kind of the neutral, like, you know, a little bit more amoral than putting global values out there. I'm confident that military conflict, while we'll see some, is never going to be the sort of fear that we saw in the Cold War. I think China and Europe and China and the US are just too closely tied together. Supply chains, economies, they can make us suffer very quickly on supply chains, but we can make their economy suffer right back. And so there really needs to be deep conversations about who we want to be together. But I do believe that the United States will learn to be more humble and more aggressive in terms of its leadership. I hope that's what this moment brings. In other words, we need strength at certain times, but it can't be the typical American, we are number one strength. It has to be marching together with other folks that are strong. China is making great progress on buildings and alternative, renewable energy, but they're also financing new coal plants in their own country and throughout Africa. So how do we have those sorts of conversations and engage? And it will require a lot of capital for us to re-engage with the world as well. But I think it'll start with Paris and re-entering Paris. I think in the UK, I'm very heartened and have been speaking, with Alok Sharma and others to play a big role in the COP, the convening of parties next year in Glasgow. And I think that can be a real turning point of showing that this world can still act together, that the United Nations can still have a role, and that alliances can be built. But otherwise, we'll have a lot of kind of anarchists at the top of different national governments who would rather preserve their own political power than look at the needs of the world and try to order it accordingly.
So just sticking with COP for a moment, and I'm afraid I'm going back to my own background of science advice in government. What scientific question or what technological development would you most like to see to be accelerated in the context of COP?
Well, I'm very excited to be playing a direct role because I think it's too short of a time for us to do a Paris 2.0 in a year. Those take a few years to develop. So it's cities that will step up. And as I mentioned, C40 is terribly named. It's actually going to be C20 initially to be the equivalent of G20. They realized that you couldn't just put capital cities in, so it became C40, and now we're 97, and we're not changing the number. But it's only, even though we're a quarter of the world's GDP in those mega cities, that means 3/4 of the world's GDP is not included under the mayors and cities that comprise that. So we're looking at announcing with Race to Zero, the 1,000 cities that will take action and commitment next December in Glasgow. And I think it'll be the biggest agreement on climate in the world. Now, the technology of what those commitments are, many different things, from electrification of vehicles and transport to the electricity sector. I guess part of me, and maybe it's just what I've been looking at this week, and the science is still out, but it's encouraging, puts a lot of hope in green hydrogen. I've been driving an electric vehicle since 1997, and was an early adopter, and we're electrifying all our bus fleet here, biggest city in America, to do that. But we, I think over time, realized that we're the #1 solar city in America, but if there's an earthquake or anything else, we can't store much of that solar power for much more than a day. And if we're going to move away from not just coal, but natural gas, which, as we know, is also quite dangerous to our planet, we're going to need some way to store fuel. It's the only way we'll ever see planes potentially that can fly without polluting a lot. So I guess that's the one I'd throw out there, is I'm hoping that green produced hydrogen from wind and solar and things like that can actually be stored and run turbines for solid state electricity, that we can bring it cheap enough and widespread enough to change the world.
Yeah, sounds good. And so thank you. And I'm resisting the temptation also to talk about there's some amazing work going on here, as I'm sure there was when you were here yourself, on all sorts of things, including one of the fellows is working on massively increasing the productivity of photosynthesis. So if you could get kind of 20 to 40% more calorific value from crops, but with the same or less water and chemistry, things like that. Anyhow, so I think I'm going to pick a final question, if I may, which is bringing you back to your time at Queen's. It's a little unfair, so you can but what was your favourite moment? Somebody has asked.
My favorite moment at Queen's. I can tell you which one was not, which was the morning after a birthday party that I had, and I had to get to rowing practice, and the gates in Christchurch Meadow were closed, and I might have had a little bit of a headache, and I had to jump over the spiky gate to get there, and I had a boat full of 7 other rowers glaring at me who'd been waiting for 15 minutes. That never happened again. That was probably the worst moment. But the best moments, I think it was, like, for all of us, not a big breakthrough. It wasn't just, obviously falling in love with my wife, performing. I loved performing comedy improv. I think it was the quiet moments. It was what I miss most is just, whether sitting in the MCR or being in my residence and somebody who sits down, who's unexpected, and over a cup of tea or something, you just begin to open up a door to a new world, their story, and share yours. And by the end of that, you understand your journey has some new forks in it, and you've seen mapped out more of the world. And life is always romanticized afterwards. Living at Oxford is just life, right? There's good days and bad days, and there's depressing days and optimistic days. And I think, it's kind of reminds me of the poem by Rilke, Go to the Limits of Your Longing, that life requires you to kind of, to do the work that God made us to do, and then to walk kind of silently out of the night. In that poem, I think there's one line that says, "Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror." And if there's anything that I kind of remember is that don't be scared of the terror and don't speed past the beauty. That is part of what life is. And if we're each to be leaders in our families, in our neighborhoods, and in our enterprises, and in our world, Oxford taught me how to pause and taught me what to do with those pauses. And I think for that, I'm most grateful.
Oh. Well, thank you. And we're all extremely grateful to you for your time here this evening. That's just been the most wonderful hour to spend in your company, and an amazing set of thoughts and insights. Really, really grateful. For everybody else who is going to stay on, there's going to be networking opportunities. As I was mentioning to you, we're trying to recreate virtually the feeling of being in the college and able to bump into each other. But I really would like to say there ought to be a resounding rounds of applause and cheering, but in the virtual world there isn't. But lots of thanks. And also, just like you've brought a little bit of Los Angeles sunshine into a kind of cold November Oxford evening. Going back to your start, it's dark here, so thank you for that. And I think I'm sure with many others, I'm looking forward to seeing Los Angeles more of it in 2020.
Yes.
really, really wonderful.
Please come visit, and everybody else. And if there's only one regret of this, and I was so happy to kick this off, is that I don't get to see the faces of everybody who's out there. So sending strength and love to all of my fellow old members and parts of the Queen's College community. And thank you for this great honor. It really has been wonderful.
Thank you very much indeed.